Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Your presentation, it's
It's
comes
visible, right?
visible. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
Okay. Jayaprakash sir.
Yes, yes,
Can we?
Shilu.
Can we
Start.
start,
We
sir?
can, we can
Yeah.
start. Sir, welcome,
Okay.
sir. Manoj, Manoj, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, 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 okay.
Okay.
Please, Shilu,
Uh,
please welcome. Welcome, sir.
okay. Okay. Dear all, Marsama College, Chungatara is organizing the fifth lecture in the series FITech 2020. I welcome you all for this talk. Today, our talk will be delivered by Dr. Manoj Purvangara. He is a faculty at the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics at TIFR, Mumbai. He obtained his PhD from IIA Bangalore, and he did his postdoctoral fellow from three different institutes, from one from Taiwan, then from Rochester University, USA, and I'm sorry, he did his postdoctoral fellow at Taiwan and Rochester, USA. His primary research interest is in the field of star planet formation and exoplanet. Today, he is going to describe us a brief history of exoplanets for the last 25 years. What are the inventions, what are the changes that when we identified the exoplanets, how is any habitable zones are there in the exoplanet zones, we have to whether we have to move to other planets to live, is it possible? Maybe he'll touch all these concepts in his talk, I expect. Okay, I welcome you, sir, for this FITech. Thank you very much for agreeing to give a talk on this series. And a warm welcome to you from the Department of Physics, Marsama College, Chungatara.
Thank you, Shilu. Am I audible?
Yes, you are
Okay,
audible.
excellent. Thank you, Shilu, and other members of Matama College for inviting me and providing me with this opportunity. I'm really happy to be here talking to you about a bit of history about exoplanets and some of the new results that have emerged in the last 25 years. Let me straight away get to the talk then, so that I want to make sure that there is enough time towards the end for discussions. Uh, the title of my talk is a brief history of exoplanets. As you can see, I have also inserted 25 years in parentheses. So it's a sort of a 25-year history. I will explain what 25 years signify and what exoplanets mean. So what are exoplanets? Exoplanets are planets orbiting stars other than the sun. These are called extrasolar planets or exoplanets. മലയാളത്തിൽ സൂര്യേതര ഗ്രഹങ്ങൾ എന്നും ബഹിർഗ്രഹങ്ങൾ എന്നും വേണമെങ്കിൽ പറയാം. What's the significance of 25 years? The significance of 25 years is the following. The first exoplanet around a sun-like star, other than the sun, of course, around a sun-like star was discovered in 1995. In 2020, it has been 25 years. And in this 25, what I want to capture in this talk is that, so after, okay, so now it's 25 years since the first discovery. So until 1995, the only planetary system that we knew before this first discovery, the only planetary system that we knew of was our own solar system. Now we know of more than 4,000 planetary systems. And what I will do in this talk is to capture this history and tell you how we managed to discover this 4,000 exoplanetary systems, and from studying these 4,000 systems, what we have learned so far. These are the two major things I'm going to cover. And this figure that I've shown above my title here nicely captures this. So this was the situation in 1995. See, I have chosen to illustrate this in a plane defined by orbital distance of a planet. That is the distance of the planet from the central star, and that is on the horizontal axis. I have shown it in the units of AU, or astronomical units. 1 AU is the distance from Earth to the Sun, or Sun to Earth. And I have also shown the solar system planets here in sort of blue cyan solid circles. On the vertical axis, I have planet masses in the units of Earth mass, right? So at 1 Earth mass and 1 AU is Earth, right? And Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars are all here around the inner planets of our solar system. Jupiter is 300 Earth masses, that's here at 5 AU. Saturn is 100 Earth masses, 100 times the mass of Earth, and that's at 10 AU. And Uranus and Neptune are further beyond in our solar system. And in 1995, when the first exoplanet was discovered, that was this, around a star called 51 Pegasus. That was a sort of a half a Jupiter mass planet, but orbiting very close to the central star. The orbital distance is, a 0.05 or something, right? AU. This was the situation in 1995. Let's see what's the situation now. So this is the situation now. These are the 4,000 planets that we know in 2020. Don't worry about the colors for the time being. The colors represent different detection techniques and all that. But just look at the distribution in this plane, in orbital distance and planet mass. So you can see there are plenty of, lot of them are within the orbit of Mercury. They are very close to the central stars, right? Much closer than so Mercury is the innermost planet in our solar system, but most of the planetary systems that we have discovered around other stars are within the orbits of Mercury. And there are most of them a lot of them are smaller planets, Earth-like planets, or slightly more massive than Earth. But there are a lot of Jupiter-sized or even super Jupiter planets as well. And there are also noticed that there are a bunch of planets beyond the orbit of Neptune. Neptune is at 30 astronomical units from the Sun. So there's a bunch of them, several tens to hundreds of astronomical units. So there are all kinds of geometry. There's a lot of diversity in the exoplanetary systems that we have discovered. Now let us see in the rest of the talk. I'll tell you how we figured all this out and what we have learned from all this. Okay. So this is the rough plan of the talk. I'll talk about the discovery, the first discovery, and the technical challenges faced in discovering a planet orbiting other stars. See, the stars, even the closest stars to us is about 3 light years away, right? And you cannot really image these planets. So you have to, so detection itself is a challenge. And that is why this was discovered only in 1995 and not before. So I'll talk about the discovery, the technical challenges involved in the discovery, and the impact this discovery has made. And then I'll talk to you about, since the first discovery, there are several different detection techniques have been developed, and I'll briefly describe some of them, or at least the main ones. And then I'll summarize the current sensors, so what all we know. And finally, I'll summarize what we have learned so far about exoplanetary systems. For example, are they similar to our solar system? Are they different? So what are the properties of these planets? What is the most common planet in the universe, in the galaxy, for example? Is it like our Earth, or is it like Jupiter? So these are all interesting questions to answer, right? So we have not learned everything so far, but some of them we are beginning to understand what planetary systems look like. So other questions that is of interest is, do all stars in our galaxy host planetary systems, or is somehow the solar system unique? So we will look at answers to some of those questions. So moving on, first the discovery and the technical challenges involved in the discovery and the impact the first discovery has caused the field. So the discovery, the first detection of a planet around a sun-like star was in 1995 by 2 Swiss astronomers from Switzerland, Michel Mayor and Didier Queloz. They were awarded a Nobel Prize for this discovery in 2019. as you all probably know by now. And the Nobel citation reads for the discovery of an exoplanet orbiting a solar type star. So the key word here is a solar type star. And that is because they did not discover, what they discovered was not the first exoplanet. It was not the first planet around a star other than the sun. The first planet, first exoplanet, in fact, was discovered in 1992 around what astronomers call a dead star, a neutron star, a pulsar. But it soon turned out that planetary systems around pulsars, such dead stars, are rather rare. So the first planet around a sun-like star, rather a main sequence, normal, ordinary star, was discovered by Michel Mayor and Didier Queloz. This is Mayor and this is Queloz. This is I've taken it from the Nobel citation. So how did they discover this? So they discovered using a technique called radial velocity method. And here is a video that I'm going to play about the radial velocity method. So, you know, this planet is going around the star, right? It's not just that the planet is going around the star. So you would have done your basic Newtonian mechanics in your BSc. This is a two-body problem, right? So in a two-body problem, both the star and the planet actually is going around the center of mass of the system, right? Of course, the center of mass is much closer to the star because star is much more massive than the planet, right? So I'll play this again. This is important to understand this. Both the star and planet are going around each other, going around the center of mass of the system, which here in this case is somewhere around here. So the point here is, the crucial point here to recognize is that star is also going around. Now suppose if the orbital plane is exactly perpendicular to us, and look at the star, it's going away from us now, and it's coming towards us now, right? So, see, we can obtain the spectra of the star using a spectrograph attached to a telescope. I hope you know what a spectrograph is. What spectrograph does is it disperses the starlight using a prism or a diffraction grating. Basically, it disperses starlight along its wavelength. They split the light into its wavelength, and you can resolve individual lines. Then now in the photospheres of stars, there are individual elements, right? Hydrogen, helium, iron, oxygen. All these lines will show up in the spectrum. Now since the star is moving, let's look again the video. So star is going away from you, coming towards you. So you would have learned this concept of Doppler shift. The star has, we are observing the spectrum, and now star is coming towards you. Then the lines will be blue shifted from its central lab wavelength. Now the star is going away from you. Yeah. Now the star is going away from you. The lines will be red shifted. Now the star is coming towards you. It will be blue shifted. That is what is shown here. The frequency of the line changes. When the star goes away, the wavelength increases or the frequency decreases. When the star is coming towards you, the frequency increases and the wavelength decreases. So you call it blue shift and red shift. So the center of the line moves. And this is the technique, or this can be used. So I'm showing this again, the star. So the observer here is at the bottom of the page. So star is going away from you. You see that it's red shifted. Star is coming towards you. Then it's blue shifted. Here is the maximum is when it's going away from you. So notice the spectrum here. This is for several lines. So you see the lines will start moving back and forth. Be red shifted, blue shifted. And now if you look at the standard formula for Doppler shift, it is the observed wavelength minus the rest wavelength of the particular wavelength of the line. So you know in the hydrogen Balmer line, the first line in the Balmer series, it's at 6563 angstrom. That's measured at the lab. But if you observe a star like this, which is moving like this, going away from us and coming towards us, you will see that line moving back and forth. And if you document or if you measure the observed wavelength, then you already know the rest wavelength, then you can find the radial velocity. And you can make a plot like this, the radial velocity, the speed with which a star is moving back and forth. And this is exactly what Michel Mayor and Didier Queloz did in 1995. They constructed a radial velocity curve like this. And from this radial velocity curve, they deduced the mass of the planet to be 0.5 mj. For half a Jupiter mass. orbiting at a distance of 0.05 astronomical units around the solar type star 51 Pegasus. And how can you measure the mass from the radial velocity curve? So here is the radial velocity curve, as you can see. There are two things that you can measure once you have constructed this radial velocity curve. One is the period, of course, the time from here to here. That's a one period of one oscillation, right? And also the semi-amplitude, what we call the radial velocity semi-amplitude. That's a distance, the from distance from here to here, or the velocity from here to here. Once you know, and we call it k, we denote it by k, which is the semi-amplitude of radial velocity curve. Once you know k and p, you can plug it in this equation. This you can derive from simple two-body Newtonian mechanics. You don't even need general relativity, just simple classical mechanics. You can connect k, the semi-amplitude, and the orbital period to the mass of the planet, star of the planet, and the eccentricity of the orbit. The eccentricity is, if it is perfectly circular orbit, the eccentricity is 0. You probably have done conic sections in your mathematical courses. So for circle eccentricity is 0. For parabola, hyperbola, it has different eccentricities. But for most of the orbits are circular, so you can drop this term. And stars are typically much more massive than the planet. So this goes away. This is just m star, and then you can measure, or you can actually calculate the mass of the planet, uncertain to the extent of sin A. I is the inclination angle. If the orbit of the planet and the star is exactly along your line of sight, so you are watching from the reference exactly along your line of sight, then the sin I is 90 and sin 90 is 1, so it's just MP. But if it is slightly tilted, then the mass of the planet that you deduce is uncertain to that extent. And this is exactly what they did, and they measured these quantities for this particular, the first detected planet or the star, and they derived this. So the important thing is to be able to measure this radial velocity semi-amplitude, which is this capital K. For Jupiter around Sun, Jupiter is 5 astronomical units from the Sun and then 300 times Earth mass. That amplitude is 12 meters per second. And for Earth around Sun, it's about 9 centimeters per second. So you need extremely precise measurements. So this has been the challenge. So the Nobel Prize is awarded to this particular discovery, not because it taught us or it ushered in some new physics or anything. It did not. I mean, all the physics that they employed was very well known. I mean, even well known to even Newton himself. But what the Nobel Prize was given the challenge, the technical challenge in making this discovery. And I want to demonstrate that to you a little bit. So I said Jupiter around Sun, you have to measure a radial velocity semi-amplitude of 12 meters per second, right? And Jupiter has a period of 12 years. So it has a long-term measurement as well. So to robustly measure the radial velocity curve with a radial velocity semi-amplitude of 12 meters per second, you need to have a radial velocity precision of 2 to 3 meters per second. Okay, so you should be able to measure the shift of these lines to the accuracy, to an accuracy of 2 to 3 meters per second. Let's see what that means. A typical astronomical spectrograph has a resolving power of 50,000. Namely, the lambda by delta lambda is 50,000. I hope you know some of these terms that people frequently use in spectroscopy. So this means if lambda by delta lambda is 50,000, this means delta lambda, or your spectral resolution element, is 0.1 angstrom. You know the unit of angstrom, right? 10 to the minus 10 meters. So 0.1 angstrom. But typically you want to sample your spectral resolution element across 2 pixels, the detector that we use for registering or imaging the spectra, right? 2-dimensional spectra. So Nyquist sampling demands that it has to be sampled at least across 2 pixels, which leads to a dispersion of 0.05 angstrom per pixel. So this translates into 2 to 3. If you use the velocity, radial velocity formula, this translates into 2 to 3 kilometers per second. 0.05 angstrom corresponds to 2 to 3 kilometers per second per pixel. But look at what we want to measure here. 2 to 3 meters per second. So you are measuring wavelength shifts of the line to a precision of 1,000th of a pixel. And that's for Jupiter. For an Earth-like planet, it is 1 in 10,000th of a pixel. So typical pixel size of CCDs are the charge-coupled devices, which we use in astronomy to detect these lights, are 15 micrometers. That's a typical pixel size. And what this means then is measuring motions of stellar lines to a fraction of a nanometer. And this is the challenge. Because there are all you have to keep the spectrograph so stable to be able to measure this kind of velocity shifts. And traditional spectrographs, astronomical spectrographs, are not this stable. So this has been the challenge, and people have been working on this from late 70s, 80s onwards, and two solutions have been proposed. One is uh, so typically the spectrographs are mounted onto the telescope, and when the telescope moves to observe a star, the spectrograph also moves with the telescope. So that introduces a lot of vibration and jitter. So how do you? So you cannot really keep the spectrograph stable, but then you can try to calibrate this movement using some reference source. That was the first technique. The second technique was remove the spectrograph from the telescope and keep it in a vacuum. Evacuated room with the temperature and pressure stabilized, so that the spectrograph is extremely stable, so that you can achieve this radial velocity precision. The first method, where you keep the spectrograph mounted onto the telescope and still be able to calibrate it. The technique is you place a cell of gas of iodine or hydrogen fluoride in the path of the starlight where it enters the spectrograph. You know, uh, so basically this the iodine and hydrogen fluoride also has lines, right? They also have lines, spectral lines. So those lines will also undergo the same movement, or that the starlight has gone through. So you can do the relative comparison. They will suffer the same instrumental shifts as the starlight itself, and you can track and calibrate all changes in the spectrograph, even if it is unstable. So this was the technique developed in the early 80s by Campbell and Walker. So this particular group, the Canadian group, Bruce Campbell and Gordon Walker. See, this group, they were pioneers of this technique, and they achieved radial velocity precision as good or even higher than the Nobel Prize winners, who eventually achieved only in 95. But they achieved this precision in 1980. They just missed the Nobel. If they had looked at a different set of stars, they would have detected the planet in 1980 itself. So that's a tragic story how this whole thing unfolded, but that's for another time. Uh, the, the second method is to remove the spectrograph and stabilize it in a vacuum, evacuated room where temperature and pressure are stabilized. And this was first tried out in 1989, and then this was perfected by the Nobel Prize winners. They used this particular technique in the Geneva Observatory when they first detected the planet. So here I show a plot which shows the precision in radial velocity in the units of meter per second, how that has evolved over the years. On the horizontal axis, x-axis, I show the years. So here is the Nobel Prize winning discovery, the LOG spectrograph of the Geneva Observatory. So you see, this same radial velocity precision was obtained by the Canadian group of Bruce Campbell and Gordon Walker in 1980. It's just that they looked at the wrong stars, and also because they didn't get enough telescope time. See, in 1980s, if somebody had proposed to observe, for exoplanets, people would call them crazy, because this was such a this work was exoplanet work was considered sort of meant for oddballs, so this was so they did face a lot of difficulties in getting telescope time and all that, but then they did have the same precision. If they had looked at, now we know, if they had looked at any of the 200 stars that we know have planets which are close by, and with their precision they could have detected, we would have had the first detection in 1980s. I would perhaps talk about this entire story later, because Bruce Campbell was the the student and postdoc with Gordon Walker, and he had to quit the field in frustration. He quit astronomy by mid-80s because of this sort of attitude from other people. But he pioneered that technique, the hydrogen fluoride technique, keeping a gas cell in front of the spectrograph. And that brought down that kind of precision in 1980s was unthinkable. See this. So although the Canadian group did not discover the first planet, and the credit went to the Swiss group in 1995, but that first discovery changed the entire scenario. The exoplanet field, which was in the margins of astrophysics and even in general science, it became the mainstream. So so what this did, it did a lot of things. It had such a profound impact, not only in astrophysics and sciences, but also in the public imagination. So in astrophysics and in science, it ushered in new detection techniques. Several people started developing new techniques to detect exoplanets. And it provided a lot of motivation for highly productive space missions. And NASA and the European Space Agency started planning for space missions to detect exoplanets. And one such space mission was Kepler satellite. And the fact that we know more than 4,000 exoplanets today is due largely to Kepler. So almost 60% of the exoplanets that we know now out of 4,000 is due to the Kepler satellite, which was launched in 2009. But the planning, the motivation, the whole impetus came from this discovery in 1995. And as I said, it propelled the exoplanet studies into becoming a principal area in astronomy. But I look at the first two aspects a little more closely. The radial velocity technique was used by Michel Mayor and Didier Queloz in 1995 to discover the first exoplanet. And then came the transit method. I'm going to describe a little bit this method a little bit in detail in a moment. This was demonstrated in 2000, and then there was microlensing, direct imaging, and various other things. We will look closely at radial velocity and transit method in one or two slides later. But it also, as I said, provided motivation or justification for several space missions. And I have listed a few of them, but I just want to highlight something here. The Kepler satellite, which was launched in 2009. So it was Kepler which changed the exoplanet science altogether, and even the public imagination about planetary systems, that other stars also host planetary systems. It was from Kepler study that we, for the first time, realized that almost every star in our galaxy perhaps hosts a planetary system. The other point I want to highlight in this plot is, in terms of future missions, our own space agency, ISRO, is planning a mission, exoplanet mission. It's in the design phase now. It's more or less officially approved, but it will be launched in 2027, 28 or so. So this is going to be very interesting how Indian community will grow in the coming decade or so. So that's good news for some of the younger people listening to this talk. So India is investing or going big on this. Okay, so that was the discovery and the technical challenges and what the impact it had on the field. Now let's look at some of the detection techniques, right? So as I said, these are the detection techniques. I'll probably focus on radial velocity and transit method, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So radial velocity technique we have seen. And let's see what transit method is. So again, the planet is going around the star, and now if the orbit is again perpendicular to you, you see when the planet is moving and you're looking at the star, then it will enter the stellar disk and block some light from the star, right? So you see from the light curve. So if you keep monitoring the star, so I'll play this video once again. So if you so we are monitoring the star, right? We are monitoring the star, and when and at some point the planet will start entering blocking the starlight. Then it will start dipping, and then it goes away. So all you need to do for transit method is keep looking at a star, and if there's a planet around it, and if the geometry, transit geometry is favorable to you, you will see a dip. And this dip, the depth of this dip depends on the ratio of the area of the planet or cross-sectional area, or the ratio of the planet radius to the star radius square, which is proportional to the area of both, right? So this here I demonstrate the radius dependence. What if you have two different planets with different radius? Here there is a planet with larger radius. Here there is a planet with smaller radius. So clearly from our the dependence, the one with larger radius will have a larger transit depth, right? So immediately you can see how transit depth. If you can measure the transit depth, you can calculate the radius of the planet if you also know the radius of the star. That's the idea. So remember, I'll play this again. You can, while you watch it, remember. So this is an important fact. Remember, in radial velocity, we can measure the mass of the star. So for transit, you can measure the radius of the star. So once you know the radius and mass of not radius and mass of the star, of the planet. So radial velocity, you measure the mass of the planet, and with transit method, you measure the mass of the radius of the planet. So once you know the mass and radius of the planet, you get the density of the planet, at least the average density, the bulk density. So, and we now have measured mass and radius for about 600 planets out of 4,000. So we are now talking about density of planets. So we can actually talk about Earth-like rocky planets and gas giants like Jupiter. So this is, amazing times to be working in this field. Now let's see transit. What if you have multiple planets around a star, and what will the transit signal look like? So one planet is large, so that is going across the stellar disk, and you already start seeing the dip, and then it has left the stellar disk, and now the second one is coming. So you started while the second one is still blocking the planet, the third one is coming in. So you see, so you can have all kind of complex shapes for the transit light curve, but one can model them. One can use sophisticated models to decode or decipher the information from this. But the point that I want you to remember is that transit method gives you you can measure the radius of the planet and also the inclination angle of the orbit. Once you know the inclination angle of the orbit, you know the radial velocity technique can measure the the mass of the planet uncertain to the extent of the orbital plane's inclination. But so if you measure a planet using both radial velocity method and transit method, you can get the mass and radius. So keep this in mind. This is one of the take-home points. So I've already showed you that the transit depth is just the ratio of the planet radius to that of the star radius square. So once you can measure carefully the transit depth, you get the radius of the planet. So although there are various techniques, as you can see, it's radial velocity and transit method which accounts for most of the planets that are known. 77% of the planets that are known is discovered via transit method, and large fraction of them, almost 60% of this, is because of Kepler satellite. And that is what I am demonstrating here again. The radial velocity and transit method, almost 96% of the planets known are these two methods. So here is the current census. What I'm showing here is the cumulative number of detections and the discovery year in the horizontal axis. So you can see after 1995, the first discovery, the red one corresponds to radial velocity. You can see initially it was all radial velocity technique, and only after 2013 that the transit thing really takes over. That is because the Kepler satellite was launched in 2009, and it's the major data release happened in 2013. And since then, the transit method, the planets discovered by a transit method, have been dominating the discovery plane. And you can also see that it's almost exponential. See, it has been growing exponentially. So now we know of, as of 24 June 2020, we know of more than 4,000 confirmed planets, and another 4,500 or so candidates awaiting confirmation. So this number is going to sharply go up, right? So the Kepler mission that made all this possible, this was launched on 7th March 2009. See what Kepler did, this satellite did was, it just stared at the one piece of sky, 10 degree by 10 degree sky. It just stared at this piece of sky for 4 years. Just looked at that sky. So there are around 600,000 stars in that patch of sky, and it carefully registered the transit light curve for these planets for 4 years, and discovered so far 2,300 planets, and more than around 2,400 yet to be confirmed. So the final tally is going to is closer to 5,000 or so. So just staring at a piece of sky for 4 years, it has discovered, it would have more or less discovered 5,000 planets. But see, Kepler had to be considered as a planet. Kepler had a criteria, so it has to see the transit signal for at least for 3 times to be confirmed as a true signal. And since the Kepler the mission lifetime was 4 years, it's complete only for planets with orbital period less than 1 year, right? So if this 1 year planet, it takes 3 years to confirm. It has to be confirmed 3 times. So all the planets that Kepler has discovered are short period planets, 1 year or less. This is important to keep in mind. And lot of diversity in the planetary system that Kepler has discovered. See, until about 3 years ago or so, a solar system was the only planet with 8 planets, only planetary system with 8 planets. Not anymore. There is this Kepler 90 system discovered by Kepler, which has 8 planets. There was another planetary system, very interesting system called TRAPPIST-1, which was in news about 2.5 years ago when it was discovered. So this is a very low mass, cool star much cooler than the sun, a tenth of a mass of the sun, hosting 7 planets, 7 Earth-like planets, rocky planets. But what was even more interesting was the entire planetary system was well within the orbit of Mercury. See, Mercury is the innermost planet in our solar system. Mercury has an orbital period of 88 days and an orbital distance of 0.3 AU or so. So this whole thing is much, significantly compact, much more compact than the innermost planet in our solar system. So you have planetary systems which are extremely compact, and you also have planetary systems which are quite extended, like the HR 879. And sorry, this T is a mistake. So what I'm showing here is a movie made of images taken over 8 or 9 years. So what you do is you block the starlight here in center. So you use a coronagraph and just block the starlight, and you see the planet. These are directly imaged planets. 4 planets. Can you see 4 planets? 1, 2, 3, 4. See, and these are images taken over 9 years. The planets are actually moving. So what you see here is harmonic motion in nature. So these planets are about 15 to 75 AU astronomical units. So to orient yourself, let me tell you, Neptune, the farthest planet in our solar system, is at 30 AU. So this planet is at 75 AU, and the closest one is at 15 AU, and the other 2 in between. So you can have, and these are gas giants. These are Jupiter-like or super Jupiter planets at large distances. So the planetary systems come in all kinds of variety. But now that we have 4,000 or so planetary systems, we can now start talking about the properties, their measured properties like their mass, radius, densities, and their orbital period. And we can ask questions like, do they look like our solar system? So what is the most common planet that we see? What are their densities like? Or are they, what are their orbital periods like? Are they similar to our solar system or different? So these questions, all of us have been asking, working in this field for the last 5 years or so. And I'm going to give you some results from the study that we have been involved in TIFR, my group, and along with my students and postdocs. So for the remaining of this talk, the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to give you these results. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to present you the results first. So these are the three important results that we have learned. Three important results, and I will explain how we arrived at these results for the rest of the talk. The first result that we have learned is that planetary systems are ubiquitous in the universe. So planetary systems are quite common. And solar system is not the only planetary system around. Almost all the stars in our galaxy host planetary systems. Not only that, uh, there are more planets in our galaxy than stars. So what I mean by this is not only that every star in our galaxy perhaps hosts a planetary system, but they host more than one planet around them. I'll tell you in a minute how we can say this. The second result that we have learned is that solar system is not a very representative planetary system. Most of the exoplanetary systems that we have discovered look very different from our solar system. Again, I'll show you in what aspects planetary systems differ from solar system. The third result, which is perhaps the most profound of all this, is that planetary properties, the planet properties that we can measure, like mass, radius, and orbital period, appear to be closely connected to the host star properties, like that effective temperature, or the spectral type, or the mass of the star, or the metallicity of the star, or whether the star is evolved. So it's very interesting. It's almost as if the planets know what kind of star it is born around. So we will look at each of these results closely now. The first result is the ubiquitousness of planetary systems. So to do this, we have to compute a quantity called occurrence rate. So what do I mean by occurrence rate? So occurrence rate is simply the mean number of planets per star having properties such as radius or orbital period within a specified range. See, so just imagine, suppose if we have surveyed all the stars in our galaxy, and if you also know that our survey was capable of detecting a planet around these stars, if they had one, then you could have simply divided the number of planets detected divided by the number of stars surveyed. That would have given you directly the occurrence rate. So it's as simple as that. But unfortunately, life is not that simple. So what Kepler did, for example, is just to stare at a patch of sky. It's not the entire stars in the galaxy, right? So our survey is not complete. There are completeness issues, and there could be selection bias. See, we might be looking at one particular star, one kind of stars more than other kinds. So there are all kinds of selection effects. So to be able to calculate occurrence rate, or the number of, for every star, how many planets do we detect, to be able to say this, to be able to compute this quantity, we need to take care of the completeness, we need to take care of the selection effects and the observational bias. But one can do this, at least for the Kepler survey, because the whole thing was homogeneously observed, and the data was reduced homogeneously. Then there is a standard pipeline. One can mathematically formulate this problem and correct for or factor in the completeness issue and the selection effects and things, and which is exactly what we have done. See, for example, one such issue is the geometric probability of transit. So I told you, if the star is here and the planet is going around it, and when the planet goes in front of the star, and consider you are the observer, it will block the starlight, right? Now, suppose what is the orbit is face on. You will never detect or observe a transit signal, even though there is a planet around the star. So you have to correct for this geometric probability of transit. Then you have to, then suppose now if the geometry is favorable to you, the star and the planet is favorably aligned to you for transit observation, then you have to ask the question, even if it transit, suppose the planet is small, is your instrument capable enough to detect it? Is your signal to noise sufficiently high? So one has to take care of various factors. I have just listed a few here. But the point to remember is one can do this very thoroughly. And we have done that. And based on that, these are the numbers that we find. One can find the occurrence rate. So here I have chosen to list occurrence rate as number of planets per 100 stars, right? And I have given it as a function of planet radius expressed in the units of Earth radius, right? So planets with radius 1 or 2 Earth radius are called Earth-like planets. Planets with radius 2 to 4 Earth radius are called super Earths. Planets with Earth radius 4 to 8 are called ice giants. So this is in reference to our analogy to our solar system planets. See, Earth, of course, is 1 Earth radius, and Neptune is 4 Earth radius, right? So it's Neptune and Uranus are called ice giants in our solar system. Uh, Planets in that radius range are called ice giants, and Jupiter and Saturn are about 8 to 10 Earth radius, 8 to 10 times larger than Earth. So they are called gas giants. But this is the occurrence rate that we get. So just to show you, these are we call them hereafter, when I use this word terrestrial planets or rocky planets, it is an analogy to our solar system. And what I mean is Earth-like planets or inner solar system planets, the rocky planets, Mercury, Venus, and Earth, Mars. And the ice giants are Uranus and Neptune. Neptune has 4 Earth radius. And the gas giants, of course, are Jupiter and Saturn, which have radius 10 times that of Earth, roughly. And these are the numbers that we find. Occurrence rate per 100 stars. So per 100 stars, there are around close to 60 Earth-like and super Earth-like planets, meaning with radius 2 to 4 and 1 to 2 Earth radius. But giant planets are very rare. For 100 planets, 100 stars, there are only about 7 stars with giant planets. So what we are finding is that smaller rocky planets are more abundant than gas giants. Now, if you were to collapse all the radius information and just find out total number of planets, irrespective of radius, Earth-like or terrestrial rocky planets or ice giants or gas giants, total number of planets per 100 stars, or then that number is 130 planets per 100 stars, or 1.3 planets per star. And this is the basis of my earlier statement that there appears to be more planets in our galaxy than stars, or in other words, each star in our galaxy, on average, appear to host more than one planet. So that is the first result, that planetary systems are ubiquitous and there are more planets in our galaxy than stars. The second result, our solar system is not the representative planetary system. Why do I say this? Here is a distribution of number of planets as a function of the distribution of planetary radius, right? So of all the planets that we have discovered, so we have here I show about 3,083 planets, and this is because we have radius measurements only for planets detected via transit method. The radial velocity candidates will not have radius information. So you see where the radius distribution is peaking. I have also shown the radius of Earth, which is 1 Earth radius, radius of Neptune, which is about 4 Earth radius, radius of Jupiter, which is about 10 or 11 Earth radius. So you see where the radius distribution is peaking, between that of Earth and Neptune. Our solar system does not have a planet which is in between that of Earth and Neptune, with a radius between that of Earth and Neptune, or mass. So our solars, but this such planets, which we call super Earths or mini Neptunes, the planets with radius and mass in between that of Earth and Neptune, they seem to be the most common planet in the planet in our galaxy. And our solar system does not seem to have such a planet. Very interesting, right? And how about the orbital period? So you know the orbital period of the innermost planet in our solar system, Mercury, is 88 days. Earth's orbital period, of course, is 1 year. That is 365 days. I have shown this in days here. 365 days Earth, and the red line corresponds to Mercury, 88 days. See where the orbital period distribution is peaking. About 8 to 10 days. So most of the exosolar planets that we have discovered are very close to their host star, much closer than Mercury to the Sun. And this has very profound impact on the properties of these stars. So for one, they are irradiated with strong stellar radiation, and that modifies the properties of these planets and their evolution. Uh, but anyway, we don't have any such planet in our solar system like that. So for these two reasons, it looks as if our solar system is not very representative, or the exoplanetary system that we are discovering appear to be very different from our solar system. Here I just show the same thing in a plane defined by orbital period and planet radius. So you see most of the exosolar planets are in this range of well within the orbit of Mercury. I also show solar system planet. And the common planet is this 1 to 2 Earth radius planet, which we call super Earths or mini Neptunes. Now we move on to the third result. Planet properties are closely connected to host star properties. So what I mean by this is, see, the observable planet properties are three: planet mass from radial velocity, planet radius from transit method, and orbital period of the planet. You can both radial velocity and transit method can give you that, right? And from once you know the orbital period, if you have some estimate of the central stellar mass, you can determine the orbital distance from Kepler's third law. So these observed planet properties, namely mass, radius, and orbital period of the planet, are very closely related to the host star properties. So what are the host star properties that I'm talking about? The spectral type of the host star. I hope you understand what I mean by spectral type. It's a effective temperature, the surface temperature of the star. So if you look up at in the night sky, on the night sky you will see stars of different color, right? Red, blue. Some of them are red, some of them are blue, some of them are yellowish. And the reason why you see them in different color is because they all have different surface temperatures. The red stars have cooler temperature, the yellow stars have slightly warmer temperature, and the blue stars have hotter temperature. And if you have also done black body emission in your BSc course, you will understand why blue stars are hotter, right? So first we look at planet properties. How do planet properties depend on the host star spectral type or the surface temperature of the star? Since the surface temperature, whether the star is cooler or warmer or hotter, that also is a proxy for stellar mass. The cooler stars are low mass stars, warmer stars are intermediate mass, hotter stars are more massive stars. So let us see how this dependency is. So this I'm again showing this. So I'll mostly be talking about these stars, these colors, right? The surface temperature are very low for in the range of 2000 to 3500 Kelvin for reddish stars. Red-orange stars have colors or the surface temperatures in the range of 3500 to 5000 Kelvin. Yellowish stars are about 5000. These are sun-like stars. Right? Sun is about 5700 Kelvin. And stars hotter than sun, around 6000 to 7500 Kelvin. I will not be talking about hotter stars here because from the most of the planets that we have discovered are around these stars with these effective temperature, surface temperature in this range. So what do we find? Let's again look at the occurrence rate, the number of planets per 100 stars. Around M-type stars, or the cooler, the lowest mass stars, they have around 200 planets per 100 stars, or in other words, 2 planets per star. K-type stars slightly less, about 175 planets per 100 stars. About G-type sun-like stars, about 1.5 planets per star, and around stars hotter than sun, less than a planet per star. So you see, cooler stars or low mass stars appears to have more planets around them. But also interesting, if we can also distribute it in terms of radius and also the spectral type, M-type stars, which I show here as red bins, the red histogram bins, they seem to have mostly smaller planets. You see 1 to 2 Earth radius planets and 2 to 4, the Earths and super Earths, rocky planets. The M-type stars have more Earth-like rocky planets, whereas M-type stars, you don't see red bins here in the ice giants and the gas giants category. No red bins here. So giant planets seem to avoid cooler stars or low mass stars, or in other words, low mass stars do not host giant planets, massive planets, Saturn like or Jupiter like planets. This is interesting. So cooler stars not only have more planets, they also host more smaller planets, and they do not host giant planets. Now, the next stellar property that I want to consider, which the planet properties seem to depend on, is called the stellar metallicity. I may have to describe what metallicity means. See, the most abundant element in the universe is hydrogen, and followed by helium. These are the lowest elements, right? The atomic number 1 and 2. And these were the two elements that was formed predominantly in the Big Bang when the universe formed. Universe is 72% hydrogen by mass and 26% helium by mass. The rest of the elements are only 2% by mass. Astronomers call these rest of the elements other than hydrogen and helium, as metals. So what I mean by metallicity is the heavy element content of the star, which is often measured as the iron content. There are reasons for it, which I will not go into. But let's just say that this Fe by H, the iron content, is representative of the heavy element content of the star. And what we are finding is that the planet properties seem to depend on the heavy element content of the star. When a star has higher heavy element content, you seem to see a particular kind of planets around them. When the heavy element content is low in a star, the planets around them are different. And this is what I'm going to show here. What I have shown here is a histogram, but I'll just describe this. The heavy element content of stars hosting giant planets like Jupiter's are much higher than the heavy element content of stars which host smaller Earth-like planets, which is higher than heavy element content of stars which host no planets. So the metallicity or the heavy element content of the stars increases as you go from no planets to small planets to giant planets. It looks as if to host giant planets like Jupiter, the stars seems need to have more heavy elements. And this is one of the robust results, observationally very robust results that have come out of various studies, not just stars. So the host star metallicity, average host star metallicity, increases with radius. This is just an average property. Here again, what is shown is a normalized occurrence rate. So all we need to look at is these three colors, red, green, and blue. The green is the solar metallicity, metallicity or the heavy element content as that of the sun. And the red is metallicity lower than the sun. Blue is metallicity higher than the sun. So what we are seeing is, as you go from smaller planet to larger planet, the metallicity, larger planet, the heavy, the supersolar metallicity stars increases. So most of the giant planets are around blue bars with stars with supersolar metallicity, and most of the low mass or low radius planet, rocky planets, are around subsolar metallicity planets. So this, what was even more interesting, this is so we were one of the first few to point this out. If you actually plot the average metallicity as a function of planet mass, so the planet mass in the unit of Earth mass, this is 1 Earth mass, this is 10 Earth mass, this is 100 Earth mass, this is Saturn, and 300 Earth mass is Jupiter, somewhere here. So going from smaller planets to larger planets like Jupiter, it increases, average metallicity increases. But after about 5 Jupiter mass or so, the metallicity again drops. I, along with one of my students, were the first to point this out initially. And this is very interesting. And this trend seemed to extend to brown dwarfs and low mass planets, low mass stars, sorry. So what's really interesting is the metallicity trend uh, goes only up to Jupiter, 4 Jupiter mass. For super Jupiters and brown dwarfs and other stars, low mass stars, it's the metallicity actually is dropping. Yeah, so Santos et al. Or the other people who had pointed this out earlier that to form a super Jupiter planet, a planet much more massive than Jupiter, this metallicity trend doesn't hold. You don't need to have very many heavy elements. We can discuss during discussion. I'll stop now. I'll summarize my talk now. Why this is so? What is the meaning of some of the trends that we find? We can discuss during the discussion period when you ask me questions, and I'll just try to summarize now of what we have learned so far, or sort of take home message. So planetary systems are quite common. I hope I've been able to convince you that planetary systems are quite common, and that the total occurrence rate is about 1.3 planets per star, implying that there are more planets in our galaxy than stars. And we have also seen that smaller rocky planets are much more common than gas giants like ice giants and gas giants like Neptune and Jupiter's. And we also, I've also been able to demonstrate that there are more planets around cooler stars or low mass stars than sun-like stars. And there are fewer planets around stars hotter than sun. Second point that I want you to keep in mind or take home with you is that solar system is not does not look like a representative planetary system. The exoplanetary systems that we have discovered so far do not look like our solar system, particularly in two aspects. Firstly, solar system lacks or does not have the most common planet in the galaxy or in the universe, which is a super Earth or a mini Neptune, which is a planet with radius in between that of Earth and Neptune. Our solar system does not have one such planet. And the architecture of the exoplanetary system that we have discovered is very different from our solar system in the sense that most of the exoplanetary systems that we have discovered are very close to their host star. So this has a profound effect on the formation, evolution of these planetary systems. They are very compact systems. And the final point that we have learned is that the planetary properties, such as radius, mass, and orbital period, are strongly dependent on the host star properties, particularly the surface temperature or the mass of the star, and also the heavy element content of the star, the host star. It also depends on the age. If you're interested, we can talk about it during the discussion that we have. So this is one of the most robust observational results that have come out of exoplanet studies. The giant planets, Jupiter-like planets, are preferentially found around metal-rich stars, stars with a higher heavy element content. And cooler stars have fewer giant planets, but host many more smaller planets than sun-like stars that we have seen already. And all these results have important implications for planet formation theories. This is where some of the frontier research in exoplanet field is moving these days. So what exoplanets are telling us about their formation. So one of the important questions that people are asking these days is, see, there is no reason why planetary properties should depend on the host star properties. What does it mean? It basically means that the planet remembers. So the question to ask is, do planetary systems preserve their memory from their birth? So this is a question that is being debated, and the reason why this question is important is because it has implications for how planetary systems form. Some of these things I can clarify when you ask me questions. So I'll stop here and I can take questions.
Thank you very much, Manoj. Sir, it is a very interesting and wonderful talk. Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. Okay, this is the question time. before going, you can either unmute and ask directly to sir, or you can type the questions in the chat box so that I can ask. Before going to the student participants' questions, can I ask you some questions, sir?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. So, in your talk, you have mentioned that the giant planets are rare in the universe. That means that is we are not observing that. Is there any particular reason for that?
Yeah, I see. For example, to form, see, this has got to do with how they form. See, there is a standard canonical planet formation theory, which is primarily based on our solar system, which is being challenged now with the exoplanet research and all that. But the standard in the standard planet formation theory, a Jupiter-like planet forms via a mechanism called core accretion. So to begin with, you have a star and a protoplanetary disk around it. The disk has both dust and gas around it, and these dust grains stick together and grow into larger and larger agglomerates. And once they once the once they form into something like 10 to 15 Earth mass core, then it accretes gas around from the disk and form Jupiter-like planets. So this is the core accretion model for the formation of Jupiter. Now, you see, you need to form this 20 Earth mass core, and the total Jupiter mass is some 300 times the Earth mass. So you, first of all, need a lot more mass out there in the Jupiter. And once you form one Jupiter, it runs out. It just finishes up all the material, and it can have gravitational effects also. So that's one thing, and the other thing is, yeah, see, you also have that other correlation that we find, right? To form Jupiter-like planets, you need higher metallicity.
Okay.
So, in the interstellar medium, interstellar medium has been progressively enriched from the birth of galaxy, right? So,
Yeah.
there is a result that we are finding, me and my student, that Jupiter-like planets probably are also younger
Oh.
in the sense compared to the age of the galaxy. So
Okay.
unless you have enough metallicity, and this probably is the reason why they are rare. But I don't think I've answered your question completely. This is an open question,
Yeah.
but there are
Yeah.
some indications towards that based on our current understanding of plant formation.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yeah, they are more massive, and also they need higher metallicity to form.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you. I have one more question. In the talk, you have mentioned that the orbital period means most of the stars that you have observed, the orbital period is small. That means
Yes,
we
yes,
don't have
yes,
any, yeah,
yes.
Jupiter-like or something. But is it our limitations to observation?
Yes, it is. To some extent, it is. So
Yeah.
all the results that I have shown you today, under the section what we have learned, and I showed you 3 results. Huh?
Yeah.
All this is strictly true only for planetary systems with orbital periods less than 1 year,
Yeah.
because Kepler is complete only up to orbital periods less than 1 year.
Yes,
So
and it
we do
is
not know
confirming.
anything about this planetary system. But with planetary system less than 1 year, that is true. The peak at 10 days.
Yeah.
10
Okay.
days or 20 days or so. But yeah, so you are right. We but see, there have been so in the last 5-6 years or so, there have been surveys for looking for planets in 1 to 5 AU, or orbital periods of 1 year to 20-30 years. It's there aren't many smaller planets there. There are maybe the giant planets may be slightly, there may be a clustering effect, but overall, I think that it's not significantly changing the picture, but it might slightly change it. But but
Okay.
but I think what I want to stress here is, you're right. Your question is right. Uh, so all the results that I have described to you today is strictly valid only for planets with orbital period less than 1 year.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And a small doubt, one more doubt. Yeah. So you said means the giant planets are not that common. Is that means the rocky planets are more easy to form?
Yeah. It in a sense means that too. Yeah. So you need a lot more. See, once Jupiter forms, Jupiter is significantly massive than anything else. So, and it has a 10, 15 Earth mass core, but 300 Earth mass. There's a lot of hydrogen helium envelope. So it clears up the disk. So
Yeah,
there isn't
inside
enough
Earth.
material left for another gas giant to form.
Okay.
Yeah. So so these questions are closely connected to planet formation theories also. So see, the thing is the planet formation theory that we have is also based on solar system, because we had only one data point for centuries, right? It's only in the last 25 years that we have
Yeah.
more data
Yes.
points.
Yes.
So our ideas about planet formation is also fundamentally changing. So
Okay.
so all these are related questions. Yes,
Okay.
that's a good question, but
Yeah.
we don't fully understand why.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir. Should I? Sorry. Can I ask the questions in the chat box?
Yeah. Or you can ask. They can also. Students can also. The participants
Uh,
also can ask them directly. Anything. I'm okay.
yeah. Yeah. If participants want to ask, please unmute and ask directly. Meanwhile, I will just narrate the question. How
Yes.
formation about star help in human life? This is question by Rashid
Say that
Krishnan.
again. How formation?
How information about star help in human life?
Well, you need to know a little bit about sun, right? For you to be alive. I mean, if sun was, see, for example, how do I say this? Yeah. Uh, See, I don't know if you are been following things closely. See, if there is a solar storm, most of our communication satellites can be in trouble, right? So see, a lot uh, of funds and investment is spent on understanding, solar storms and solar activity, because it has profound effect on our satellite communication, and the fact that me and you are I'm talking to you on the internet and other things. So yeah, I think so this is just the sun, but if you for other planetary systems, the third result that I was telling you, the planet property seems to be closely related to the stellar property. So there is a saying among exoplanet community: "Know thy star, know thy planet." If you know the star, you know the planet. It's almost like that. So it's very important.
Yep. Okay. Next question by Kavya Palsan. Sir, exoplanets are almost similar to their. It is written host planet. I think it is host star. So, is it possible to have life on exoplanet of Earth?
So the question of life, I deliberately did not go into that. See, the first step in towards addressing that question is to identify habitable zone, what we exoplaneteers call habitable zone. So now we have a kind of a working definition for habitable zone. Habitable zone is defined as the zone around the star uh, where see, in that the temperature of the closest star in our closest planet in our solar system, Mercury, is higher than the temperature of Earth, right? See, the planets do not produce their own energy. They absorb sun's light and then arrive at an equilibrium temperature. So planets which are far away are at cooler temperature, and planets which are close by are at higher temperature. So that the habitable zone is defined as as a zone around a star where temperature is such that water can remain in liquid form. In the Earth's atmosphere pressure, that's about 300 Kelvin, or 290 to 300 Kelvin, right? But then, so around other planetary systems, you have to find that. So it depends on the central star. It also depends on whether the planet has an atmosphere, because if you were to just calculate Earth's temperature from solar radiation, it will work out to be something like 260 Kelvin or something, less than 0 degrees Celsius. But that's not the temperature on Earth. And this is also because of greenhouse heating, that Earth's atmosphere itself is. So we are now trying to identify Earth-like planets in the habitable zones. And there are about 2 dozen or so such planets which are in the habitable zones. And the next step is to study their atmospheres and other things more carefully and more detail to look for traces of life. Yeah. So, but that's a question we can take up or even address scientifically a little later.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Next question by Amal Sri. Sir, if we block any brightest object with some opaque object smaller than the source, we could not detect the presence of the object due to diffraction. Since the source is brightest, the entire light will pass the object without leaving any presence of it. Then how transit method is possible to the brightest stars as compared to the smallest planet?
Okay, so you can do this experiment. You have a bright source, and somehow measure the total intensity from that bright source. Then you block some part of the area with a small, some cardboard, circular cardboard or something. Then measure the intensity with the same instrument and compare. Convince yourself it happens. So, so people do it, right? But then you need high precision for this. See, for example, uh, to detect Earth-like planet around Sun, you need a precision of 100 parts in a million, or 80 parts in a million. See, I don't know if you see. It's a thousandth of 1% photometry. See, so you need to. So what it means is, out of a million photons, if suddenly 100 photons disappear, you should be able to tell. So it's a difficult experiment to do, but it's if you have that kind of precision, you can do it. But you should try it yourself and see. Without
Yeah.
before speculating, why don't you just try it out?
Yeah. Thank you. There is another question. I think this is the question by Kavya. So she was clarifying that it is, I mean, human life, is it possible on exoplanets like Earth?
Yeah, so I don't think we are in a position to address that question yet. I mean, possible. I mean, life is possible on Earth. I mean, we know there's life on Earth. So yeah, there are all kinds of possibilities. But see, that is not the same as saying definitely. See, I think it's important to recognize this difference. You can speculate all you want, but that's not how science works, right? But also appreciate the fact that we are probably the first generation, me and you included, first generation living with the definite knowledge that there are planets around other stars. See, our ancestors had speculated, but what does it even mean? But now we can definitely say, right? I mean, nobody can argue with it. We have even imaged planets by blocking the stellar light. You can't argue against with an image, right? So this is. I think you have to take a moment and appreciate the importance of significance of that statement. So we are the first generation to live with the definite knowledge of that planets exist around other stars, and that means something. So this is how science work. We say things when we know. We don't. Science doesn't indulge in speculation, right?
Yeah. Thank you. The next question by Jidin. Um, is there possible? Is there any possibility for the formation of an exoplanet in a different shape?
No, so the definition of planet itself. See, the physics tells you. See, you in our solar system there are rocky structures. Like in asteroid belt, there are rocks, and in the Kuiper belt beyond the orbit of Neptune, there are large rocky uh, things. So, but once the thing is above the mass of Mercury or so, the hydrostatic equilibrium dictates that it has to be spherical. It says that the gravity will shape it beyond a certain mass, and planets by definition are above that mass.
Okay.
So it's just simple physics. You can
Yeah.
work it out.
Yeah. Another question by Jidin again. Do any volcanic activity takes place in super Earth-like planets and gas
Yeah,
giants?
very interesting question. Yeah, so that's uh, uh, see, it's still being debated, but there are one or two papers. I mean, in fact, one of my collaborators, he might give a talk in TIFR soon. Uh, they have claimed that some of the signatures that they see in transmission spectra of one of the planets is evidence for exomoons. They are not talking about exoplanets, exomoons and volcanic activity in exomoons. So yeah, there are a lot of interesting claims, but there is no consensus on this. These are being debated. These are in the frontiers of research.
One next is a personal question. So, do you personally believe that life exists on other planets or moons?
Yeah, see, in science, it doesn't matter what you personally believe, right? I mean, uh, it has no use. I mean, no value. That is not how science functions. You know, how you have to. Science is doing. Science is actually experiments. You know, experiment is the. See, what makes science different from other knowledge production methods? It's at the heart of science. There is a method, and that method is basically experiments and observations. You can have wonderful theories, but it has no value unless you can actually, confirm it in an experiment. So, yeah, scientists don't, scientists' personal belief is of no value.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We use stars bubble to detect exoplanets. If it's possible in case of binary stars, then how we do differentiate that?
Binary stars, it will be, you can already say it will be complicated. But if you can separate out the spectra from spatially resolve them, that's okay. So we do spectroscopy. See, we do stellar spectroscopy routinely. We have been doing it from the second half of 19th century. See, once Fraunhofer identified those lines in the solar spectra, and then once spectroscopy kind of emerged, that was the birth of astrophysics, right? So from late 90s or 1880s, we have been doing spectroscopy, and so that's not a and this is what we use to detect. So binary stars also you can do if you can spatially separate them, but if the composite signal, then there are issues. Other questions?
So I think that was what is exoplanet? It is the last I saw the question by Rashid.
What is exoplanet? I thought I started by explaining what is exoplanet. Exoplanets are planets orbiting stars other than the sun. As I said, മലയാളത്തില് സൂര്യേതര ഗ്രഹങ്ങൾ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ബഹിർഗ്രഹങ്ങൾ എന്താ പറയുക?
Okay.